I'm very excited to have our next panel, or maybe I shouldn't be excited because it's a depressing topic. Take that back. We're going to look at the role of ISIS, somewhat in the Middle East, although you'll know from the panel I have here that part of the construction of this is to think about this as not just being a Middle East problem, because clearly it's become a global problem. ISIS, we are technically, officially, here in Canada at war with ISIS. And yet it's still in its infancy. And as academics, as analysts, we're all just trying to understand it. I'm very happy to have the panel that I have here. I have to say this, someone asked me in the washroom just, was this hard to put together, this conference? And I said, no, actually it wasn't bad at all. It was pretty easy, and partly because I have so many great friends, I have to say. So I want to thank all of the people who just immediately said yes and happy to be a part. I know I owe them one, but that's the beauty of this game. But I have some amazing colleagues around me in this community, as you all see, and they've been really amazing to come and talk about these issues. So to my immediate left is Dr. Lorne Dawson. He's a full professor in the Department of Sociology and Legal Studies and the Department of Religious Studies, which he chaired as well in 2006. Most of his research, and he really is, may I say, the guy. Can I say that? You're the guy to talk to. I know. He's really the guy to talk about the sociology of religion. And he has an amazing team with him as well that he leads on several capacities to talk about religious movements. His research in the study of new religious movements is something that I've generally been so happy to read, to try and understand ISIS, because we really do have this enigma out there that we don't get. His best known book perhaps is Comprehending Cults, The Sociology of New Religious Movement, published in 2006, but he is obviously a well-known professor in this field, has written extensively on it, public commentary, op-eds, etc. So we're really happy to have you, Lorne. Thank you. To his left is Dr. Paul Freston, who's the CIGI chair in Religion and Politics in Global Context here at the Balsillie School, and he's also with the Religion and Culture Department at Wilfrid Laurier University. He's also a distinguished senior fellow and director of the Program for Studies of Religion in Latin America, Institute for Studies of Religion, Baylor University, and professor collaborator in the postgraduate program in sociology in Brazil. And also, I have to say, Paul, thank you so much for being here, who comes with an extensive record in talking about religion generally, and has an avid interest in the Arab Spring. I know very well from our own private conversations, so this is really coming all together. Simon, did so great in the last panel. We said, why not just come back? And if I could have him in every panel, I would. Good friend Simon, thank you again. We all know your work, but just to repeat, CIGI's Global Security and Politics program, and is also a doctoral candidate at Carleton University's NIPSIA. So again, thank you all for coming. So let's talk about ISIS. I have to say, it's still an enigma for most people, right? We know the media coverage is gruesome, horrific. We see these beheadings. We hear about it. We're not sure where are its tentacles spreading. There's so much question mark as to whether or not the two past terrorist incidences in Canada were really ISIS-directed. Were they inspired? Were they, as Max Abram calls them, loon wolves? Not just lone wolves, but loon wolves. There's so much mystery about this group that I have to say is still relatively not a big organization, right? We're talking about 50,000 people. Yes, it's recruiting in not in droves, but it's important to us because we hear about the last 10 individuals stopped at Laval Airport. We hear about Midwestern girls giving up their free-spirited life to go become an ISIS bride. There's so much out there that just kind of perplexes us all in trying to understand this. So I want to start with Lorne, if I could, because we've had this conversation, you and I, and it's been probably the most enlightening in terms of me trying to understand ISIS. So if I could get that back conversation, I wish I recorded it because I want to go back and reference it all the time. But Lorne, what's your take as a sociologist who studied this? Explain what is the attraction to ISIS?
Oh, God. Just a simple question to start off with. So Maybe I'll preface this with a little background, too. So in addition to the sociology of religion and new religious movement material, since about 2008, I've been involved in terrorism research and a lot of work on issues of radicalization. And in 2012, I was a co-founder and I'm co-director of the Canadian Network for Research on Terrorism, Security, and Society, which has been growing exponentially since it was founded, and now we've secured funding. We have significant and secure funding running through to 2022. So we've grown from 3 universities to 10 universities, from 3 government agencies to 10 government agencies that are partnered with us, and have 160 research affiliates, and are formally partnered with 6 different other research centers around the world on similar issues. So that's, I'm bringing that to bear as well. I don't even know where to begin to plunge in here. So I'm also in the midst right now of research that is about 6 months in, where we're actually interviewing foreign fighters. We're interviewing their family, friends, associates. We're interviewing wannabe foreign fighters, anyone we can lay our hands on in this regard. So we have accomplished about 75 interviews. When I say the interviews with foreign fighters, there's about 26 of them at this point. And these interviews are admittedly not conventional interviews. We're talking about extended Twitter dialogues running over months, and we're talking about a few Skyped interviews. But there's a great body of data and information we're starting to acquire. We are just transcribing and just starting analysis, so everything I say is impressionistic on the basis of the team just discussing what's happening. So, I mean, we are under the impression, and this is probably maybe what Bessma is alluding to, I've always been of the belief that religion is far more important in this regard than, it's obviously my background, but I would say the substance of the situation supports it. Religion and a religious appeal is far more important than is probably given credit in most of the academic literature, and to be honest, specifically literature written by political scientists and international relations scholars. It's just different professional biases and things of that nature. So I'm talking, though, in terms of the rank and file. We'll have lots of time probably to talk about the differences between leadership and rank and file. When it comes to ISIS, you have to be really careful in making this distinction. The leadership of ISIS is truly a black box, although we are gaining some insights, and there are things we can say about Ba'athist influence on the leadership of ISIS and things of that nature. The rank and file that we're speaking to, and when I look at the other literature available on the recruitment and on what primary data is coming from other sources like the International Center for Study of Radicalization in London, Peter Newman's group, who we are in dialogue with on a pretty regular basis. The rank and file are really into this as a utopian, millenarian religious experience. All they want to do is talk about religion. The only way we can get them to speak to us is to show our familiarity with the language that they want to use, the ideas they want to stress, to sympathize with their enthusiasm in a neutral way, obviously. But if we weren't able, if my research assistants weren't able to convince these individuals, we have problems. They want us to convert. It's just like dealing with a new religious movement. So, of course, we have to constantly deal with that issue that in one case, it's a Muslim researcher, in the other case, 2 cases, not Muslim researchers. But we have to convince them that we genuinely are at least really open and neutral. We're careful in our language, but we also have to drop the right references religiously, speak about the right individuals online who we know they're sympathetic with, and things of that nature. We're convinced it's a genuine religious enthusiasm on their part. Now, that is rooted in the fact that most of the people we're talking about are quite young. They are quite naive. They have a very limited grasp. Even those who are already in Syria or Iraq have a very limited grasp of the geopolitical realities of the situation they're in. But that's not really pertinent to understanding why they were drawn to the cause and why they continue their enthusiastic support, even while in sometimes quite difficult circumstances that we hear about in bits and pieces in our interactions with them. The other thing, though, that the radicalization literature on the whole seems to be, we've always felt brought to the fore, and we're starting to see some evidence of, is that identity is the issue, right? And it's about identity crises, and it's about adolescent identity crises. And we sense we've always known this, and this is something that kicks around in radicalization literature for a long time. When we're not talking about pathological identity crises, we're talking about highly conventional identity crises. We're talking about things that when I look at the literature on adolescent conversion in general, meaning born-again Christians in the United States, etc., it resonates all over the place. So it has to do with certain kinds of needs and issues that individuals under certain circumstances, particularly children of immigrants, caught in the classic managing two identities scenario, which some of you may know of, some of you don't. If you don't, then feel free to question that later. Working out their issues and arriving at a point, as social movement scholars say, of cognitive opening where the jihadi narrative arrives. Now, the other key component, which we're also now seeing new elements of, is we've always known that the process of radicalization is a group phenomenon. It's about social networks. It's about something happening as a group. In every case where we think we are dealing with a lone wolf individual like Andre Poulain from Timmins, our research showed before the media or anyone else was aware of it, we were aware of the fact that he was not alone, that he had traveled to Toronto, that he lived in Toronto, that he lived with 4 Bangladeshi young men who are radicalizing, who have also left, whose fate is unknown, that he was very active on various sites out of Toronto, and that actually with 1 year he'd gone from being a complete novice in Islam to being someone who was actually providing what was seen as authoritative advice to other young people about how to be a true Muslim within a Salafi interpretation of it. So it's very much we have to understand the group social psychological dynamics, which can be understood using very conventional social psychological, well-established social psychological principles. So all of that kind of thing can go into this. ISIS, I'll just leave a final comment then. ISIS, though, is a game changer because ISIS has brought new elements into the picture. Most of what I've said so far would apply to an al-Qaeda context and to people radicalizing, homegrown terrorists radicalizing, Toronto 18, groups of that nature. But ISIS is a game changer on multiple fronts. First and foremostly, they're a game changer because the nature of their narrative, the nature of their appeal. Al-Qaeda has always held out the appeal that you need to come and join the Ummah, really become a member of the Ummah, and engage in a defensive jihad, fighting for the social justice for your brothers and sisters in Islam. That is still, of course, in the ISIS call, but ISIS first sets out a call that says you cannot be a true Muslim. They hit the identity issue right off the bat unless you get out of the land of the kuffar. You must come to a place where you can lead a pure Muslim life. You need to love Islam by rejecting the West. And that call is what first resonates with people. It's a message about corruption and purity. It's about a call that you need to purify yourself to achieve this identity, and you can't do it in the corrupt environment in which you currently exist. Then political messages and things get layered into that. That's the call. The other thing I'll just mention that is unique about ISIS, of course, which we've heard ad nauseum, is the extraordinary use of social media and the extraordinary production capacity in terms of their media and propaganda. So currently, ISIS is producing about 4 to 8 high-level videos per day out of Syria. They're flooding the market with this material. They are purposely targeting Dutch, French, English, German audiences. Most of it's in Arabic, but they purposefully siphon off some and produce high-quality translated product. And then, of course, by accident or purpose, they discovered that their fighters being involved in continuous Twitter contact with their friends and relatives, as they always were, was an incredible asset. And they really employ that. And we're aware of a very large community, rapidly expanding community. And truly, I can come back to this, it's a community of individuals who are in very regular contact with a wide array of individuals that are either fighting or supporting the fighting in some regard. And there's a whole kind of new heroic status being associated with merely being in contact with these individuals and providing moral support for them.
So can I mean, we've had this conversation before, and you gave me the analogy that finally made sense to me, which was it's like a cult, right? I mean, is that, I mean, describe, I mean, from your research, I mean, you're an expert on this in the sense that these new religious movements, these cults, whether they're, you know, Jonestown or they're, you know, in Tokyo, they have a certain characteristic. What makes this a cult, in your opinion?
Again, a bit of a loaded question. I don't know if I'll use the word cult. We'll use the word new religious movement, right? Cult is the popular term everyone likes to use. Essentially the same thing. But what we're finding is, I just find, and my research colleagues who have some background in this as well too, are finding that more and more the data is lining up with the pre-existing data on new religious movements, a lot of which also aligns up with social movement literature more generally. But I suppose, I don't know, there's so many ways to go at this. I suppose the one thing to go at it is that we got to realize we are talking about identity issues. We're talking about an emotional process. We're talking about a group of individuals, though, that are not suffering from any kind of abnormality, which is in line with research literature from new religious movements. They are remarkably ordinary individuals that are doing something extraordinary. But we have instances of this all around us in society all the time. These individuals are actually, on the whole, bright, inquisitive, somewhat overachievers, right? They experience enormous frustration with the moral inadequacies of the society they grow up into. They're not individuals that are rejecting the morality or the norms of their parents. For the most part, they've actually thoroughly been socialized to the norms of their parents and then become disgusted with the nominal role in which their parents play in their religion and the ways in which society is characterized by apathy and by hypocrisy. And all of us, when you go back to imagine when you were a 16-year-old, you have this kind of moral indignation that many people have. This is really at the key of it. So the other element to swing to the other side is then once they've seen the light and they've converted, they've joined. And especially if you're talking about an individual, let's take the individuals from, we don't know any details. But let's take the 10 individuals from Quebec that Bessma just referred to. They were all willing to get on the plane and go. They've had their passports taken away from them. Now what? They're not under arrest. We have nothing in Canada to deal with them at all. We have absolutely no programs, no procedures, nothing in hand with which to deal with those people. A few of them, in the face of this shock, will fall away. The majority will not be deflected in their heart of hearts at all. They're going to continue to be radicalized, and they're going to continue to promote a radical agenda as best they can, supposedly. I mean, maybe they're under some kind of restrictions that would prevent that. And this is because it's not about clear argumentation. You're not going to deconvert them or de-radicalize them by giving them logical, clear arguments about the nature of their situation. You're more likely to dissuade them. I'm being a bit just grabbing things. You're more likely to dissuade them, as some of the countering violent extremism programs around the world are discovering, by reminding them of how much damage this is going to do to their parents and their siblings in the community that they're leaving. Reminding them that their parents will be stigmatized, ostracized, embarrassed, be shut out of their communities. And that is more likely to have an impact on them and get them thinking critically, because it goes back to these identity, emotion issues that are at the core of things.
This is great. I'm going to turn to Paul but I have to flank the reality here that, you know, we have two political scientists on either end of two sociologists. And one thing that Lorne alluded to is that, you know, political scientists come at this from a very different end, which is very true, because we look at this as, you know, ISIS came not from, you know, somewhat, well, I shouldn't say yes or no, but part of the explanation for the rise of ISIS is also the political vacuum that's been created in this area that allowed this group to fester. You know, one of the things you talked about was that much of the appeal of some of these young people who are joining is a cause. And that cause, in some way, we found as political scientists, was a reality of the humanitarian crisis that came out of Syria and Iraq today. So there are these, you talked about the psychology of those that join. And it's interesting because you said that some of those that join are bright, etc. We've seen, on the other hand, a lot of political scientists point out the schizophrenics. I mean, we just found out that the Lind Cafe fellow was diagnosed as a schizophrenic. We have those who, they're picking up the Islam for Dummies at the airport on their way to join ISIS. Again, these are all to sort of challenge the whole religious argument. And then we also have this other, like you pointed Andre Pouillon, but he so-called converted like 2 weeks before the incident, right? So wasn't it a week or two? I mean,
no.
No? Okay. Am I wrong? My bad.
More than a year.
More than a year. Sorry, are we talking, maybe I'm thinking about the BC. Sorry?
Martin Couture converted.
That's it,
very
right.
briefly.
Exactly. So I mean, how much, I want to push you on this, and I'm going to let Paul come in and then of course go back to Lorne, but as political scientists, and again, we all have our own silos, and one of the things that's unfortunate about disciplines, and one of the things that I love about this school is really trying to break down these silos. So Paul is my neighbor, and we get a chance to have this conversation because we don't have these academic silos where sociology is on department 3 or floor 3, and we're on floor 4 or 2, whatever. But how much of this is really about this appeal for religion? And why do you see it? And because I saw you shake your head in the yes, why do you see this as a religious issue and not necessarily the political one that perhaps Simon and I probably would appeal to?
Well, I don't think it has to be either or, does
Yep.
it? Yeah, I mean, there's been a fascinating debate about how Islamic is the Islamic State.
Right.
But I mean, I'd like to look at it, if I may, through two analogies. One analogy with Nazism, and secondly, an analogy with the Leninist concept of the vanguard.
You may have to introduce some of these concepts to the students.
Well, we'll get a lot. Nazism, I don't think I need to introduce, surely. We can say, was Nazism due to Germany's defeat in World War I, the Treaty of Versailles, the Depression? Well, yes, it was due to all those things, of course. But on the other hand, where did the specific ideology of Nazism come from? And I think that's the problem with explanations such as I have heard at this school, actually, of Islamic State in terms of what Britain did in Iraq in 1935 and what the United States did in Iraq in 2003. Yeah. They're both very important, but they don't, they're not sufficient explanations. And of course, we need to distinguish causal factors from facilitating factors. I'm sure a lot of people joined the Nazi Party out of opportunism, out of desperation because they were unemployed, out of misguided patriotism, and so on. But that doesn't mean that there wasn't a genuine Nazi ideology, which was important to understand. And I think that many of the objections to accounts of Islamic State that emphasize religion, many of the objections to those accounts miss the point, because these accounts don't have to be at the expense of economic, political, and military accounts. But we need to explain why the specific phenomenon of Islamic State exists, why it believes what it does what it does, writes what it does, films what it does, as it does obsessively, as Lorne has been saying. Mm-hmm. So I think that there isn't much point in an academic context in trying to adjudicate debates about how Islamic the Islamic State is. Politically, I can see the importance of stressing that it's not. I understand the political desire to do that. Theologically, it seems that it's a debate best left to knowledgeable Muslims. But sociologically, we can at least say, I think, that it's very religious. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But of course, does that explain ISIS totally? No, it doesn't. But precisely the idea of religion as a fenced-off part of life, which is unmingled with the rest of life that we call the secular is precisely an invention of the modern West, which doesn't help us for understanding phenomena such as Islamic State. Now, the religiosity of Islamic State is most evident, I think, in its eschatological aspect, when it talks about the end of the world, the last times, what's going to happen in the future. And lots of elements have to do with that. Why does it call its online magazine Dabiq? My pronunciation of Arabic names will be hopeless, but precisely because Dabiq is a location in Syria which basically it's Armageddon, we would think of in sort of Christian terms, Western terms. The notion of the caliphate itself, the justification of sexual slavery also has to do with eschatological considerations. So, of course, there are many other historical examples of this, principally from the Christian world. And even today, I would say, if you think of the influence of Christian Zionism, which is sort of the unconditional Christian support for the territorial expansion of the state of Israel, which has a tremendous influence on American foreign policy, that is also eschatologically inflected in a similar way. Of course, most of the victims of Islam, many of them are Shia Muslims. And this anti-Shiism is not only a strategy, it is a strategy, yes, to provoke a civil war, and then Islamic State can present itself as the only defender of the Sunni. But it's not just that. It also fits into a centuries-old tradition, which has been accentuated in recent times, especially through Saudi influence. So we find that ethno-nationalism combines with Salafi jihadism, just as Marxism used to combine very easily with nationalism in third world contexts in the past. These things don't have to be fenced off and separate. And all this, of course, has been fed by American policy in Iraq, and by al-Maliki when he was prime minister, and by the current attempts of Shia militias being deployed to retake Ramadi, and so on. That all feeds into that. So the question of Leninism, the Leninist concept of the vanguard. Al-Qaeda's strategy was basically to be a sort of catalyst for an uprising of the Muslim masses, which would be a spontaneous revolution. And it was the old anarchist strategy from the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The point of all the anarchist terrorist attacks was to try and mobilize, spark an uprising amongst the masses. On the other hand, Islamic State is not that. It's closer to Lenin, if you like. It's closer to the Bolshevik idea that you have to give history a helping hand. You have to take history by the scruff of the neck. You have to make the future happen now. It's in theological language, a realized eschatology. You bring the future into the present. You don't wait for God to do it, you do it yourself. You take power and you hold it through a process of permanent revolution. In fact, to take the analogy further, we could ask, could there be a Stalinization of this? Stalin talked about socialism in one country when it became evident that the Bolshevik Revolution wasn't going to spread around the world. Could there be a caliphate in one country? I would say no. That would be a very complicated idea. But also, I think, another important factor in the rise of Islamic State is sheer luck. It's been incredibly lucky. It's had help from the Assad regime in various ways. There's been lots of evidence for that. And it had the coincidence of a rise in sectarianism in Iraq coinciding with the arrival of the Arab Spring in Syria and the falling apart of Syria. And the binational nature of Islamic State, of the territory that it controls, has been a great help, it seems to me, and a tremendous stroke of luck. But also, of course, they have their own merits. Lorne has talked about the question of their incredible marketing. Also, they've learned from the mistakes of their predecessor organizations, especially Al-Qaeda in Iraq, with al-Zarqawi, and some of the mistakes that he made, especially in relation to his relationship with the tribes in Iraq, which led to the awakening, the mobilization of the tribes against their influence. And they've done as much as they can to prevent something similar happening where they are. And of course, in a sense, the virtues of their governance in the areas where they do govern, both in the sense of their security, provision of security, and provision of impartial, although extremely rough, justice. And in a civil war situation where people have been suffering for years in the absence of precisely those qualities, that undoubtedly exerts a pull. So I think I don't know whether you wanted to ask about the finances, but
well, you know, yeah, we'll definitely get to that.
Yeah,
I want to give Simon an opportunity because, and again, just to put this in, and I agree that you don't need to have it either or. It doesn't just have to be sociological or political, but that does point to different factors, right? Because, you know, political scientists, when they're convinced this has a political issue, they do see the potential for a military way to defeat ISIS. Whereas sociologists' view of this being more religious and ideological would argue that, you know, military can't defeat an ideology. So there's also, you know, there's something here that also suggests that we have different ways of also hammering at this literally. So Simon, give us your take. What's your explanation for the appeal or rise of ISIS?
Thanks. First of all, I just want to say this is one of the best conversations on this topic I've participated in. I haven't even said anything yet, which is just fantastic. A couple of points right off the bat. One, I really do appreciate the analysis and the empirical data brought to the table, because in many ways, you know, what appeals to ISIS, what appeals about ISIS to a potential recruit is really fundamentally, it's an empirical question. You know, we can debate it all day. My own academic background and training, you know, I would try to put together a quantitative model, and then it doesn't, you know, all these things can matter. It doesn't matter. They're not exclusive. You can have there can be a genuine religious motivation. There can be a genuine, you know, identity crisis, and there can also be, you know, financial incentives to join ISIS, which we've seen, you know, fairly compelling anecdotal evidence, you know, there. The second general point I want to make is that what's, you know, really good about this conversation is that, you know, we can discuss and you can meaningfully assess, you know, what's appealing about ISIS using standard, you know, psychological tools, diagnostics, protocols. The nice thing is you can also assess it as an organization, as an armed organization, using really some of those same workhorse empirical tools. And in that regard, you know, ISIS, what's interesting about it is how uninteresting it is. If you strip away some of these sort of vibrant aspects of it, the production values of their propaganda, their willingness to commit atrocities on camera in a way that you just don't typically see. Strip that away. Strip away the rhetoric, and you know, there's a lot about the organization that makes a lot of sense. It seems from, you know, captured documents and whatnot, it's very well organized. It has a really good bureaucratic backbone. Yeah. They keep track of where they spend money. You know, it's not quite Mick Collins asking for receipts for every bullet you use to, you know, shoot somebody or blow up a army barracks in Northern Ireland, but they have a bureaucratic backbone. They've recruited heavily from Saddam Hussein's security services, and they recruited some, you know, fairly good talent at what they do. Well organized. You know, it is very hierarchical, which may be a weakness, but in many ways they're very conventional. The finding that some ISIS recruits are actually probably above average in terms of educational aptitude and their skill sets and whatnot. It's actually fairly consistent with a lot of empirical research on terrorist groups and insurgencies, that people with, you know, what we call higher human capital, better educated, successful people, actually make good insurgents and terrorists too. And then we look at, what happened in Iraq starting in 2005, and then, where ISIS, I think it's more than just they learned from their predecessor, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. I mean, in many ways, there's evidence that there has been continuous leadership in one shape or form since then. Their strategic errors they made in Anbar, they learned from them.
Right.
They were dealt a golden hand by the civil war in Syria, which created the conditions where they could find strategic depth, rest, recuperate, fundraise. So many of these aspects, I mean, this is just an example of a well-run insurgent organization with a clearly defined political agenda. They do provide some form of governance. Again, we get this through anecdotes. We get this through defectors. We get this through some journalists who've managed to worm their way in there and whatnot. But, they do have some state-like attributes. Are they brutal? Yes. Do they face some long-term real strategic challenges? I mean, yeah, they certainly do. And that's why I think probably military force is probably a viable option in the long run. It's the only way to deal with them. That doesn't mean it's socially desirable. But in many ways, yeah, I mean, it's great hearing this analysis because I really am a believer in just you go to the data,
Yeah.
right? And if you have, true blue believers, and this is a millenarian kind of impetus they have to fulfill. That's, from a policy perspective, incredibly useful to know. But many of the other explanations that we can just pull out for ISIS's success, I mean, they're just really, it's interesting how kind of bog standard they are.
Let me just throw that back. I mean, because, I'm also kind of trying to study this from afar, not with the kind of research inside out of talking to some of these recruits, but, Paul, you talked about Dabiq, which is obviously this really important magazine that they produce, where a lot of the so-called scripture justification is kind of used in their propaganda. It's a recruitment tool, very shiny, glossy, almost like a magazine. And they really do put a lot of effort. I think that's something we all agree on in terms of their social media strategies, really top notch. I think last count was they had at one point 70,000 Twitter accounts. There was a sweep to reduce them. It went down to 40,000. And then in a matter of a month, they got back up to another 10,000. So it's really hard it's a whack-a-mole strategy. But you point to Dabiq, the magazine. I think about another book that's apparently quite influential, according to some Brookings researchers, which is The Management of Savagery, right? Yeah. Which, if you read Management of Savagery, and there's a great interview, I really encourage the class to look this up, with the author or the scholar who looked at The Management of Savagery with Anna Maria Tremonti on The Current. And there's nothing Islamic about it, right? I mean, this manifesto is practical. It's about how do you get people to succumb to your will, right? And it's a very Machiavellian. I mean, talk about political theory. It's not religiously inspired. It's very Machiavellian. So that's one thing I have a question for you about. So how do we explain that? And then finally, when we look at the returnees, right, there is a high number of individuals who, yes, may go with this goal of purification, goal of finding themselves or fighting for a cause. But what's interesting and what we're getting as a snapshot of those who are coming back is the insight that actually they go there and they find that it's full of hypocrisy. They make up their own rules. There's no Islamic nature to it. So there's a lot of disillusioned returnees that are coming back that say they're making up rules like you can't smoke, which is not an Islamic, dictum. And that, what goes for, the foot soldiers is not happening at the top echelons, which makes me think, well, how much of that top echelon really believes in this scripture argument and how much of it is just propaganda for recruitment? So it gets to the essence of, again, is this a political organization or is it really this religious one that's, relying on ancient scripture to try and justify its raison d'etre? So, Paul, I'm throwing that onto you. I know it's a big order, but I'd love for you to think about that.
So can't the religious be Machiavellian as well?
Yeah.
But once again, I don't think one has to make incompatible arguments here. I think that the Machiavellianness, actually, there are probably very good religious justifications for it, and they would probably cite them if pressed. So I don't see that as incompatible at all. As to the question of sincerity of belief, that's a problem, isn't it? Again, it's closely connected with the modern Western invention of the concept of religion, the idea of sincerity of belief, and it doesn't necessarily apply across the board. So I'm not sure if we should judge degrees of sincerity by ways that we might want to, standards that we might want to judge it by. Are you going to ask still about the question of the future, how we, or do you want to?
Yeah, please, Lorne, jump in on this.
Yeah, I mean, there are, again, so many things that could be said. I mean, I fully agree with Paul, and I just want to sort of draw a big underline under it. My work, I just call an enlightenment prejudice, right? Because we really have to recognize, especially, let's just take us as Canadians, our natural attitude is to assume that religion and politics are separate spheres of activity. But that is not the viewpoint of most of the people living on this planet. It was not the viewpoint of most of the people that have ever lived on this planet. And there has also historically been a wide range of apocalyptic millenarian movements in almost every society we can think of on a continuous basis throughout human history, something which, again, we have very little awareness of because it's part of our Enlightenment prejudice, too, that we live in a rational society. So we really have a strong tendency to project our conception of how societies operate on the rest of the world, historically, socially, culturally. And that really interferes with our capacity to understand this question with regard to ISIS and a lot of other groups. Apocalyptic groups have been Machiavellian since the dawn of time. And they've always blended politics and religion. In fact, in apocalyptic research, like research, or historical research, etc., on apocalyptic movements, there's sort of a law. Literally, it's something that's sort of generally, universally accepted by scholars, that apocalyptic movements leverage political crises, right? They take advantage of whatever the current political crisis is and use it to advance their cause. So then we get into the question of the rank and file versus the leadership. The leadership is heavily influenced from what we're gathering from the articles in Der Spiegel and elsewhere, right? It seems that Ba'athist party members have had a decided, influence on the hierarchy of ISIS. The chief military lieutenants in Syria and in Iraq are ex-Ba'athist generals, right? So they're coming from a secular background. We either have to believe they've magically converted over to an apocalyptic viewpoint, which is conceivable, or more likely there's some kind of utilitarian element going on here, a strategic alliance that's struck. But that's not accounting, to go back to Paul's point, that's not accounting for why this group is unique and why it succeeded, and it's certainly not accounting for the fact that why it's attracted more foreign fighters than any group in recorded history. I mean, they're wildly successful and continue to be wildly successful in that regard.
Can you explain that? Because you've looked at that comparatively, right? I mean, you've looked at how other movements have recruited. They haven't gotten nearly as many.
No, if we're talking the total number that went to Afghanistan, it's maybe about the same number of individuals, but stretched out over a 15-year period. So we're talking about equivalent numbers as went to Afghanistan in a 4-year period. Now, the vast majority of these individuals are coming from, there's all these complexities. Tunisia is the place where the Arab Spring worked. It's the single greatest source of recruitment for foreign fighters, by far, exceeding by thousands any other place. The second greatest source is Jordan, right? So you work your way down the list. Europe comes, England with 700, France with maybe over 1,000 or something of that nature, are quite small potatoes by comparison. But collectively, of course, for the West, this is a jarring experience. But the other element, there's so many standard things to bring into play here. So the one I always use when I'm talking, let's say, to the RCMP or something of that nature, I do these workshops with the RCMP inset units all the time. So I always start with a standard thing that many of you, even students, might have encountered in your sociology, political science courses, political sociology, social movements, and that's what's called the problem of social action. So the problem of social action shows that people have grievances, and you can demonstrate that a certain population shares grievances. You do this quantitatively. And grievances are undoubtedly extremely important to what's going on here and to why ISIS exists. And those grievances are political, geopolitical in various ways, or humanitarian. But the problem of social action points out that in any case where you have a population of people strongly holding grievances, a small minority does anything about it. And then we can demonstrate an even smaller minority decides that violent action, especially violent action, let's carry it further. An even smaller minority is willing to lay down their lives, not just go to prison, but die for a cause. So you get this sort of, you know, it's winding down. As you move across these levels, religion becomes increasingly important as a primary motivator. Doesn't mean they've lost the grievances, they've lost the politics. It means what's driving individuals to be willing to sacrifice their young lives completely and the lives of their families is something greater. It's about a greater transcendent cause and purpose, and their belief that they are individually doing something of extraordinary importance and significance. That's where the caliphate comes into play. The caliphate really upped the ante again in cinching this notion that you're doing something that transcends history. And it's important to you. You get to play a key role. You, little old you, play a key role in saving the world. That has tremendous appeal to individuals. Now, returnees, they return disillusioned. Well, that's a double-edged sword, cuts both ways. That just proves my case. These are really idealistic, super committed individuals who go and then find out, oh my God, they're just as apathetic, corrupt, or whatever as the rest of the world is. They grow up, mature, and come home, which is the standard pattern for people joining new religious movements. One fact I always throw out in classes, etc., we have good, really good empirical substantiation of this. 90% of the individuals that join a new religious movement leave voluntarily in less than 2 years. Wow. 90%. Really good support for that. We don't know. In most cases, we can't test that out with terrorists. I suspect it applies to those who radicalize and join terrorist groups too. But regrettably, they either die or are imprisoned, right, or in exile, and we don't know. Right? Now with returnees, maybe we actually have a group of people that will start to be able to test to see whether they're working something out. It's pretty extreme what they're working out, but some of them work it out and come out the other side and say, I realize there is a better way to go about doing this, a better way of achieving significance in my life. But we remember a third of them die. That's empirical evidence too. A third of foreign fighters die, and they usually die within about 6 months of entering the conflict.
And they're pushed to the front lines, right? We know that ISIS actually takes those foreign recruits more so than the homegrown ones, i.e. from Syria and Iraq or locally. They take the foreign ones and push them out and give them a gun and go fight. The most dangerous assignments, you know, so it's, I mean, there is a higher self-selection there of them.
One thing, later Iraqi Baathism had moved in a more religious direction. That should be remembered as well.
True, absolutely. So let's get at some of these other questions of how do you stem this, right? I mean, so, you know, we've thought of, we talked about sort of how to, or why ISIS is able to recruit, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on how do we stop it? I mean, how do you put this down, especially thinking about in terms of its ideology, recruitment, and finances? What are the tools at our disposal? I'll start with Simon because, you know, I think we as political scientists, you know, we love to give policy advice. That's kind of what, you know, our I think we just want to be politicians that ended up in this building. But where do we go? I mean, what's the recommendations you would love to have thought about in our way of fighting ISIS today?
Well, I'll stay away from how to deal with, you know, foreign recruits and whatnot because Lorne and Paul are probably better to discuss that. But one point that I think does need to be stressed, and we've seen this, you know, after the fall of Ramadi, the way that newspapers and internet blew up with all sorts of, you know, giving, you know, President Obama a scorecard, giving his national security team a scorecard, you know, because Ramadi fell. there's been I don't think there's been a tendency to underestimate ISIS's ability, its appeal, or its spread. I think actually in a lot of policy circles that's been fairly well understood, even if they don't understand why. There hasn't been that much underestimation. What we have seen is tremendous underestimation of the ability of the Iraqi security forces.
Absolutely.
Everybody thought it was bad, right? Nobody thought that the Iraqi army was in good shape and a well-run, rational organization. Last year before Mosul fell, but nobody was 100% sure. So what you see now, for example, what Canadian forces are doing up around Erbil, when they train Kurdish Peshmerga, who generally had this reputation of being, better trained, more effective, more coherent fighting force, they discovered they have to do things like bring up basic marksmanship. You're getting situations where you're asking guys to bring their GPS units from home if they have one.
Yes.
Because we need to teach you guys how to use a GPS unit. Because one guy in a company of roughly 100 infantry knows how to use this. I mean, there's been major institutional decay. There's been the graft, corruption, and whatnot that we have seen. It's on I think it's on a scale
Absolutely.
that was maybe an order of magnitude larger than people anticipated. So the timelines that have been given to bring the Iraqi armed forces in general into shape. I mean, let's say we just want to purely look for a military solution for this. Right? Let's just pretend that. I mean, it's 12 to 18 months are the most optimistic timelines I've heard before the Iraqi armed forces can start any sustained offensive operations. And this is maybe not what you want your press secretary saying if you're prime minister or president who's putting people in harm's way, but that's the realistic assessment. And the concern right now that I have is simply, we talked about this morning in Syria. There's a little bit of, let's say, there's certainly media fatigue. There's also policy fatigue. Other things happen. And certain files get bumped down the list, in the Pentagon and the Department of Defense. Money's fungible, and if it doesn't look like pouring more dollars into the Iraqi armed forces is getting a result in the next 6 to 12 months, there are other uses for that money. Yep. And so a major concern now is simply that the size of the task is so tremendous to get. We're not talking about turning Iraq into a liberal, democratic, pluralistic state. We're talking about getting their armed forces up to the situation where they can do their job at a minimal level. This is going to take much more time than is generally we generally talk about, and this is the only place this is talked about is behind closed doors. It's not entertaining. It's not good for CNN for a 30-second soundbite. Saying, okay, 24 months from now, maybe they'll have their act together enough to take back Ramadi. But it's getting that time frame realistic, getting a good realistic sense of the scale of the challenge, taking seriously that this is a movement. IS is a movement that has some staying power, but it is not without vulnerabilities, that there needs to be some strategic patience here.
Yeah. Let me ask, and again, for the whole panel to talk about too, the 7-point plan that the coalition put together, the international coalition that Canada's a part of, that they put together was a pretty decent plan in terms of, it covering a lot, right? It wanted to go after the finances, and part of that was to ensure that the oil that had been used to smuggle out of the country, or I should say primarily into Turkey actually for sale, and in the Kurdish regions also stopping the sale of oil to the Assad regime, which as well was a big part of their revenue source. So part of the coalition's plan was to bomb certain places outside of Raqqa, particularly to stop the oil flow. We know that another element of this is to try and prevent recruitment. So there's an enormous amount of capacity building on things like countering violent extremism, some interesting funding programs that I'm sure all of us have heard quite a bit about. Also, increasing the capacity of the Iraqi central government, right? I mean, this was really about getting the Iraqi forces to be the interlocutors on the ground to fight against ISIS, which we've seen, and Simon's done a great recap here of pointing out that they really haven't been up to the task, and I would say probably because of a good 5 years of completely stripping it of all professionalization under the Maliki government, whereby it became a private militia of the Maliki government. And even though we have a new prime minister, and I think the Turkish ambassador really pointed out this quite well, who I think is quite sincere in wanting to do a better job. He says all the right things, and then yet we turn around and we see, I don't know if you're following the takeover of Ramadi now, the Iraqi forces, they have a very sectarian slogan as the code name for the battle, which is, taking us back, 2 steps, even though we're already quite far behind. So, I mean, how do we stop this? Even though we've seen the Americans, primarily the Americans, because 95% of all the bombing, we keep saying, oh, we've got our CF-18s and yada yada. We'd love to be proud of our participation, but we're really a small part of this, mostly because it's the U.S. bombers that are the ones that are really needed to do the big tasks. But for example, telecommunication towers, right? I'm still amazed that they're able to put up all this propaganda on which really feeds the recruitment. Let's not forget, this is very sexy. They're able to put up these what I call I want to call them, what's the word of videos? Puff videos, is that right? Snuff videos, yeah. They're snuff videos, right? I mean, they're really gruesome, but they do appeal to a certain segment of individuals who find that intriguing. It's, call to action. Why can't we get a hold on that? Why do we still have 40,000 Twitter accounts? We keep hearing about them taking out some of this command and control and communication towers in Raqqa, but, clearly they're not doing it fast enough. I'm sure Simon, who's following this on the political front, has seen the New York Times yesterday talking about, U.S. commanders, and NPR has had this big splash about this as well, that U.S. commanders feel hampered, right? That they're not able to actually take out the targets that they want because they're so... Every site is being vetted by 3 or 4 different people to ensure that there aren't civilians killed, which, by the way, is a good thing. Like, I'm not saying that's not a good thing. But now you hear the Americans coming all after Ash Carter last weekend saying that basically the Iraqis don't have a will to fight. All this analysis coming out saying that, part of the problem is that, we can't go gangbusters militarily against ISIS because of the fear of civilians being killed, which is not a bad thing again. I have to keep saying that. But it does point out to the reality that the military option it's not working. Something's not working there. And so I'm throwing this back to Paul and to Lorne to give us an assessment of what works on some of the issues that you guys have touched on. How do you get at an ideology? What has worked in the past against new social movements? Do they just fizzle out? I mean, I'd love you guys to give us the history and comparative angle here of how do we really think about a non-militarized solution, which, again, the military factor hasn't been very impressive.
I'll leave some of the more nitty-gritty stuff to Lorne, I think, because it's more his area of empirical research. But I'd like to try and sort of think about your question through another analogy, not with Nazism or Leninism this time, but with firefighting. 3 main ways of fighting fire. One way is with water, right? You throw the water directly onto the fire. That would be military intervention, right? That would be the analogy there. Military intervention has several problems. First of all, it seems to be what they want. Right. Right? It's Dabiq all over again. And also, they seem to be able to compensate losses in one place with gains in another. That's another advantage of being binational and so on. The second way to fight fire is with fire. You burn around, right, and to try and prevent the fire from being able to spread. So there are some of the things you've been mentioning, counter-propaganda, in which you're trying to counter the attraction, especially talking about outside Syria and Iraq, basically, in other countries. Various sorts of containment measures, whether military containment, online containment, financial containment. And the third way to fight a fire is to let it burn out all by itself. So what's that? That's the wear and tear of power, of the exercise of power, because Islamic State is not like Al-Qaeda. It's not just a terrorist group. It's a terrorist group and an insurgency and a state. And as a state, it is vulnerable to the wear and tear of power. But also, of course, it's vulnerable to the weakness of all utopianisms, which is the chronic gap between aspiration and reality. So that is another thing that over time will hit them, and possibly, of course, another awakening, as happened in Iraq in 2007, whenever it was, and could happen again once the people under IS rule start to tire of them and see a way of opposing them.
Wow. Lorne?
Yeah, so I'm going to say somewhat similar things, but I'll start with a kind of a proposition that may resonate with some of you and strike some of you as odd, and that is that in a certain sense, Al-Qaeda has won. And there's scholarship that's coming around to this view, meaning that, of course, they've introduced into the world a certain ideology, a certain perspective on things that is persisting and is spreading and has strength and has appeal. So even though Al-Qaeda as an operating organization has been hounded into near oblivion in some regards, and maybe that can be debated, but certainly they have shrunk dramatically. In another sense, they have had an incredible success when you historically think about what they've accomplished in terms of changing people's worldview, their understanding of alignments, and I'll just leave it at that. Having said that, so then let's haul up another element from sociology of knowledge, which is this idea of plausibility structures. All ideas, though, still rest upon some kind of material structure, right? Plausibility structures. So military action to degrade or even ultimately destroy, although that I'll put in quotation marks, ISIS's plausibility structure, its material infrastructure, will be successful because it will undermine the ideology to a certain extent. But this has got to be a really long-term endeavor, because the short-term response to that kind of intensive destruction of the plausibility structure of the movement will be increased radicalization, increased extremism, desperation, and probably a lot of, I would imagine, terrorist attacks inspired by ISIS or actually directed by ISIS with returnee fighters in the Western world. If they're backed into a corner, they will act in desperate ways. Now, here's the problem. History tells us, if we take something like the Taborites in Bohemia, in European context, who's an apocalyptic group that ruled over a big chunk of Central Europe for decades, right? So they're an analogous group. Or if we take a group like the Taiping Rebellion in China, for these groups to be defeated and their ideologies to fully be crushed involved massive military action and basically genocide, meaning basically outside forces had to come in and slaughter men, women, and children, and we're talking in huge numbers, the believers. Also, fatigue set in. These were groups that, over decades of being in power in a territory, lost their way, and then internal corruption and things we're seeing with ISIS started to happen. So that's sort of the lesson from history. So really, I think we're stuck with a kind of containment strategy: degrade them, contain them, give up part of Syria and give up probably part of Iraq, get some kind of stable situation going in Iraq as best you can. Syria, God knows what will happen there. And just hope that they kind of implode on themselves, because we're obviously not willing to undertake the kind of actions that the Chinese, the Emperor of China was willing to do, imperial forces in China, where we're talking huge bloody warfare, or European princes were willing to finally do in Bohemia, right? Just to use two instances, we could grab on dozens of other situations. So I think that's kind of the reality we're stuck with, but we're not going to defeat the ideas very readily. Counter-narrative, which is the sort of lingo used to talk about this, is really a messed up area, and there's all kinds of research being done. I'm reviewing it all right now for a government, upcoming government meeting. And we're going to be bringing in some of the leading experts in the world in a short while to a special meeting in Ottawa, closed-door meeting, to really seriously talk about, can Canada engage in counter-narrative? Bottom line is there, too, is I don't think the government's willing to come up with the kind of investment that would be required to effectively mount counter-narrative.
That's a good, I mean, that's a good lead off to the final question I have is, I mean, if you could take all the resources, the military, because we're spending a lot of money militarily, I mean, it costs money, and put it into counter-terrorism or countering violent extremism code for PC wording today, do you think that's a more effective strategy for fizzling out ISIS?
I mean, to cut off at least the supply of foreign fighters, the only logical route, you can do what we're doing, right? You can disrupt, right? So we can find the people, take their passports away, et cetera, and that will have an impact. But really, you have to engage in prevention, and there's pretty widespread consensus about that around the world, governments and security forces, though no clear idea of how you're going to do it. And if you are going to do it, it has to involve massive investment in resources dedicated to communities and getting the communities, the grassroots, really engaged and involved in the process. And before you can do that, you have to build trust. And that's a long, slow process too. And we're a good 5 years behind doing this. A few places in the world, like in Denmark, they're ahead of us, right? In England, to some extent, they're ahead of us. So in some places in the Midlands, the Muslim community and the constabulary have actually developed very effective working relationships where they have situations where when groups come into communities trying to promote radical ideologies, the police only have to stand back and make sure things remain peaceful. The local Muslim community comes out en masse, protests, and stops the things from happening. They go to markets where people are promoting the ideas. They line up around their stalls. They turn their backs to the people, like they just create a human barrier around the stall. Basically, not breaking the law. We're just standing here in the market. We happen to be blocking access to the stall by anybody in the community, and we're sending out the message, we don't want you here. But it took, when you talk to the people who did this, it took years of dialogue and interaction to develop the trust in local communities for that to happen. And it takes a lot of money. In Canada, we have now, it used to be called CVE, RCMP CVE. They now just changed it to TPP, Terrorism Prevention Program. That's a step backwards right there, the change of name. And they announced the CVE program in January. And to this date, they've only done a few teeny preliminary things. We have grassroots efforts happening in Montreal right now that probably will be successful, led by the community. And Calgary's local Muslim community, with under the leadership of Mari Kaskas and some other community workers, have accomplished more than anyone else. And they're doing it on a shoestring, and they're doing it on a voluntary basis. So,
that's great. Can I just, can I ask Simon, foreign boots? Do we need foreign boots on the ground to combat ISIS?
No,
Please
and
say no. Oh,
that would be a
thank God.
really bad idea. Just to, one point I'm going to disagree with Lorne on is, well, even if, I'll put it this way, we're talking about we're not willing to do this, we're not willing to do that militarily. It doesn't matter what we're willing to do. There are people, there are organizations in the region, if they can get their organizational act together, who are willing to do what it takes to wipe them off the planet. And that's what concerns me, is that there's Canada, I mean, I have lots of friends in the armed forces and whatnot, so I don't want to ever say anything bad about the Canadian Armed Forces, but what the Canadian Armed Forces is doing there ultimately could be done by somebody else. And the scale at which the United States is intervening, the scale at which the Gulf countries are intervening, the scale at which Canada is intervening, ultimately this could be, that capability, if we were to take that away today, could be filled in through other means. But they wouldn't be pretty means. They would offend a lot of North Americans with liberal sensibilities. But, you know, frankly, the debate right now that needs to be had is about, you know, whether it's going to be necessary to rein in Baghdad, because they may resort to drastic measures. And, you know, it's not just that they're going to name, they're going to give military operations incendiary names. It's that they're going to rely from soup to nuts on irregular forces to do the dirty work, and they're going to be able to do it. I think right now there's no appetite. historically, you look at insurgencies, I find that, using some of the empirical tools and assumptions we use to analyze insurgencies, patterns of, that kind of violence are more useful for understanding what's going on in Iraq right now, rather than the classic, terrorism models that were developed in the past. Insurgencies tend to end when either they win or there tends to be, very, very, very large application of military force. And I can't think of a single Western country that wants to send in an expeditionary force of that size, nor should they. It would be a colossal disaster. But that doesn't mean that there aren't other countries around there that might feel it necessary, or some step perhaps short of that, to secure their borders, secure their future, and to do this. And that's the challenge right now.
I challenge to say that there's actually no Middle Eastern military ready or prepared to fight ISIS in many respects.
Not ready to fight them in Syria, but ready to fight them in Iraq, yes.
Yeah. Paul, last words for you.
Slightly more positive note.
Yes, please do that for us, Paul.
Three things, I think, three problems that Islamic State is going to have.
Yep.
First, what I would call ideological self-strangulation. All right? The Nazis, when they invaded Eastern Europe, Ukraine and so on, in many places they were greeted as liberators from Stalin. And if they'd been a bit more intelligent, we might say, they could have made a heck of a lot out of that. But they were imprisoned by their own ideology, racist theory that Slavs were slightly above Jews, right down the bottom of the ladder. So I think that in the same way, IS will be similarly ideologically constrained as an actor, and it'll be difficult for it to morph into something significantly different. I mean, it could, in theory, one could say, well, they could consolidate control over the part of Iraq that they have, the part of Syria that they have. Probably the old borders are no longer going to be recognized anyway. They're going to fall apart. They could establish a new state which would come to be internationally recognized seat at the UN and all that. I don't think that's going to happen because of their ideological limitations with regard to that. So ideological self-strangulation. Secondly, utopian self-destruction, which is I've already mentioned before. The tendency to self-destruct of all utopianisms. And thirdly, war economy limitations.
Right.
Right? So I think those three things will be bottlenecks for them, and will influence, in a sense, they'll help the fire to burn out.
Fascinating. Well, wow. Thank you so much for this amazing panel. Please thank them for me.